again, Sierra, and thanks everybody for showing up. My name is Rick Marizon. I'm a small game biologist at the Department of Fish and Game, and or as we possibly can about small game. It's a pretty broad topic, particularly if you're not familiar with it. But there's a lot of information, and hopefully I'll try to touch on most of it and answer most people's questions. But obviously, if not, there'll be some time at the end to ask questions. Oh, there we go. Now it's working. Great, thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, so I guess one of the first questions I often get is, well, what is small game in Alaska? And a lot of people think it includes squirrels and basically everything that is smaller than a caribou or a moose in Alaska. According to Alaska Department of Fish and Game regulations and the Board of Game, small game is defined as grouse, ptarmigan, and hare. So those are the 9 collective species I'll be talking about tonight. So we have 4 species of grouse, 3 species of ptarmigan, all 3 species found in the world actually, and 2 species of hare. I'm going to start with the grouse and ptarmigan. So just generally, I'm sure many of you have probably seen if you haven't actually been hunting for one already, you've probably seen some grouse or ptarmigan while you're out hiking or mountain biking in Alaska. They're fairly abundant and widespread and often quite visible to a lot of people. But generally, if you haven't seen one, grouse and ptarmigan are under the collective bird term called tetranyds. And all tetranyds are pretty heavy bodied. They kind of look like a football. They have round, short wings, typically designed for short flight. And all of our species in Alaska are quite unique in that they all use snow burrows in the winter to survive our long, cold winters. One thing that we found through our research studying various species throughout the state is that they all suffer very, very high mortality. A 2 or 3 year old ptarmigan is about average, and a 4 or 5 year old bird is quite old actually. And if you are a birder, amateur birder like myself, they have pretty animated breeding displays in the spring, which are often really fun to watch. So as I said, we have 4 species of grouse: the ruffed grouse, sharp-tailed grouse, spruce grouse, which is the most abundant throughout the state, and sooty grouse, formerly known as the blue grouse. The ruffed grouse is native in Alaska throughout the interior areas north of the Alaska Range, Fairbanks Delta, Tok, and all the way throughout central and western Canada down into the Midwest, the lower 48. Sharp-tailed grouse actually are known as sort of a true prairie grouse, but we actually have native populations up here in Alaska as well. And we don't have prairies, but we do have something very similar in that we have large expansive forest fires, which in a loose sense simulate a large prairie setting. And that's where typically folks find sharp-tailed grouse. Spruce grouse are sort of the mature forest-dwelling grouse species that we have in Alaska. They're quite abundant here in South Central and the Matsu Valley and the Kenai Peninsula. They are the most heavily hunted and harvested grouse species in Alaska. And then the sooty grouse only lives in Southeast Alaska, really kind of south of the Lost Coast or the Malaspina Glacier, including all of Southeast Alaska. So I kind of touched on this a little bit already, but one question I get asked a lot is, well, where can I find these different species? And I like to present this as sort of a continuum of different habitat regimes across the state. So starting on the far left, you have your typical prairie, or in our case, a forest fire environment, which is where you see sharp-tailed grouse. And then as that area begins to reforest and fill in with aspen and birch and young spruce trees, you get real dense forests, and that's typically where our ruffed grouse populations really move into those areas and do quite well. And then as that forest begins to mature 50, 60, 70 years after a fire, that's typically when you start to see bigger spruce trees, white spruce trees, and some of the aspens begin to die out, and that's where you see spruce grouse. And then down in Southeast, in the rainforest is where you see sooty grouse. So ptarmigan, we have 3 species of ptarmigan, like I said. The willow ptarmigan, which is the largest and also most abundant and heavily hunted and harvested of the ptarmigan species. Then we have rock ptarmigan, which is probably the most widespread across the state, but it's slightly less abundant where it does occur than the willow ptarmigan. And then the white-tailed ptarmigan, which only occurs, it's endemic to North America, which means it only exists in North America. And in Alaska, that means that it's only found from the Alaska Range and south. So that includes the Chugach, the Talkeetna Mountains, the Kenai Mountains, and throughout Southeast Alaska. So again, a popular question that I get asked is, well, where can I find these different ptarmigan species? And what we found through our research is that ptarmigan really do move quite a bit over the course of a year. But this time of year, before the snow starts to fly, this is sort of a general pattern of where you can find these birds. Whitetails typically exist in the real high craggy peaks, often where you'd expect to see mountain goats or Dall sheep. Rock ptarmigan tend to live in those areas, sometimes commingling with whitetails, generally fairly up high, but also some of those more bald slopes where you might find blueberries and crowberries, and often a lot of lichen species. And then the willow ptarmigan is pretty well named. It lives down in the alpine creek bottoms where there's willow. It eats willow buds or stems throughout the year, certainly in more frequently in the wintertime, but it does eat willow buds and stems throughout the year. So this is sort of a typical scene from the front range of the Chugach looking out towards Anchorage, and pretty good depiction of where birds can be found this time of year. When the snow begins to pile up, as we'll see in the coming months, the higher elevation locations, the birds just can't find food anymore. So that forces those birds to move to lower elevation. And we'll see in a later slide some data that we actually collected from radio collared birds that demonstrate that pretty well. So that kind of covers our tetranylids. And then we have two species of native hare in Alaska. A lot of folks don't know that we have two species of native hare. They think, they may know about snowshoe hare, but they also might think, they see a lot of domestic bunnies hopping around their neighborhood sometimes, but that's not what I'm talking about. We have the snowshoe hare, which I'm sure most folks have either seen or heard about, which is fairly widespread, fairly abundant across the state. But then the lesser known species is known as the Alaska hare or tundra hare. And that exists really only in extreme western Alaska, from Kotzebue throughout the Seward Peninsula near Nome, throughout the YK Peninsula, and then down throughout the Alaska Peninsula in Bristol Bay. And the Alaska hare is a pretty unique species. It weighs anywhere from 6 to, in some cases, based on some of our capture work, 15 pounds. It's as big as a red fox, or in some cases even bigger. They tend to stand 2 to 2.5 feet tall, and are very, very reclusive and elusive. When that we've learned a great deal about this species over the last couple of years. It's a pretty challenging critter to study. But then the more common and widespread snowshoe hare exists here in South Central Alaska in pretty high numbers. They're quite a bit smaller. They weigh in about 2 to 3 pounds, stand about a foot tall. And our snowshoe hare, we know for sure, go on these very large population cycles. And right now, the hare population in South Central is at its high. The hare hide generally moves from north to south. And so Fairbanks, Delta, Tok, areas like that in the interior are about a year or so past the high. We're going to see the high here in South Central this year, and then likely in the Kenai Peninsula within another year or two after that. But it's a great opportunity to get out and hunt these little critters. They can be pretty challenging at certain times of the year, but it's another great opportunity. This is the kind of a typical habitat picture. A lot of folks hunt both of these critters in the wintertime when traveling across the snow is quite easy. And both of these hare species live in some pretty dense vegetation. So using snowshoes or skis or even snow-goes can be more advantageous than trying to find them in the summer or fall. But they typically reside in these very dense, overgrown areas where there's really good cover from predation. So that kind of covers the species. So I wanted to jump into the regulations as far as small game hunting. For those of you that have ever attempted to big game hunt, you're probably familiar with our regulation booklet and its challenges. It's a very dense, information dense booklet that can be very challenging to understand and interpret. Small game hunting is not that way. Small game hunting is pretty straightforward, whether you're an Alaska resident or a non-resident. So if you're a resident, all you need is a $45 hunting license. You don't need any tags or registration or permits or stamps or anything like that. You can just simply buy your Alaska hunting license, and you have all of the legal requirements met to go out and hunt. If you're a non-resident, if you have friends and family that want to come up and join you, we have a non-resident small game license. It's an annual license for $60. And that license also then enables a person to hunt waterfowl and cranes and snipe. There are other regulations associated with migratory waterfowl and cranes, but if they simply want to go grouse, hare, or ptarmigan hunting, that's all they need. So as far as the hunter's education certificate, this is a lesser known fact or point in our regulations that some folks aren't aware of. So if you were born on or after January 1st, 1986, you must have completed a basic hunter education course. That if you take it in a different state, say you moved up here from Montana or North Carolina, and you took it there, it will apply up here. You don't necessarily have to take it in Alaska. But if you want to hunt waterfowl, small game, or big game in Alaska, and you were born on or after January 1st, 1986, in these particular game management units, which we'll get to in a minute, you need to have taken that hunter education class. So in game management units 7, 13, 14, 15, and 20, and for those of you that aren't familiar with where those units are, it's not I'll get to it here in a minute, but basically the road system of Alaska. So those game management units include Fairbanks, Delta, Tok, the Alaska Range, the Denali Highway, the Matsu Valley, the Kenai Peninsula. That's largely what those units encompass. If you're under 16 years of age, you must have completed the basic course or be under the direct supervision of a licensed hunter who is 16 years or older and has completed the course, or born on or before January 1st, 1986. So for those of you that aren't familiar with how the Fish and Game sort of parses out the state into what we call game management units, there's 26 game management units across the state. And you can see those large red numbers on this map. You'll notice some smaller red lines that designate what's called subunits. So in areas that receive a lot of hunting pressure or there's a lot of complex regulations, the Board of Game has opted to further subdivide those game management units to make it easier to understand the regulations. So in order to understand where you want to hunt, that's sort of one of the first big steps you want to figure out in our regulations. So for those of you that are in Anchorage right now watching this presentation, you're in Unit 14, specifically 14 subunit C. So we just say 14C. For those of you sitting in Palmer and Wasilla, you're in Unit 14B. Talkeetna is, 14A, and Talkeetna is in 14B. So that's sort of the first big point you want to try to figure out is where am I going to hunt and what game management unit am I going to be in? So if you get our handy dandy regulation booklets that are available at most large retailers like Fred Meyer, Walmart, but they're obviously available at our offices as well. The small game regulations are really effectively one page, and it's pretty much that simple. It's this regulation, or this page is, I think it's the second or third to last page in our regulation booklet. But I'm just going to run through this really quickly so that you have an idea of how to interpret the regulations based on where you want to hunt. So let's say you decide you want to go grouse hunting in 14B, which is up near Talkeetna. You just, first of all, you want to find the cluster of species, obviously, that you want to hunt. So under grouse, and then go down the left-hand side of the page, until you find 14B, which is about halfway down that section. And you can see those large red numbers on this map. You'll notice some smaller red lines that designate what's called subunits. So in areas that receive a lot of hunting pressure or there's a lot of complex regulations, the Board of Game has opted to further subdivide those game management units to make it easier to understand the regulations. So in order to understand where you want to hunt, that's sort of one of the first big steps you want to figure out in our regulations. So for those of you that and you proceed across to the right, and it says 15 per day, 30 in possession, of which not more than 2 per day can be ruffed grouse. And then if you continue further on to the right, you see the season date of August 10th to March 31st. So we're about 6 weeks into the hunting season right now. So that, in a nutshell, is how to interpret the small game hunting regulations. It's really that simple. There are a couple areas that I'll mention here in a minute that have slightly more complex regulations. And so let's jump into that. So about 2 years ago, I guess it was, Fish and Game produced what I consider a really useful field guide to interpreting regulations in Game Management Unit 14. So obviously, Game Management Unit 14 encompasses anchorage, anywhere from Portage, Girdwood, Anchorage, Eagle River, Palmer, Wasilla, all the way up to Talkeetna. And that is arguably one of the most densely populated locations in the state. And as such, the Board of Game has opted to create different methods and means based on where the human population centers are in Game Management Unit 14. And as a result, the regulations can be more complex, particularly in 14C, which is the Anchorage Bowl. So everything south of the Knik River Bridge, including Birchwood, Chugiak, Eagle River, Anchorage, Indian, and Girdwood. And you can see on the lower right-hand side of this slide, when you open up this field guide, which is free and available at all of available at the Palmer and Anchorage Fish and Game offices. When you open it up, it's sort of a regulation. It's a map designed format so that you can understand the regulations that way. And if you have any specific questions, we can maybe touch on those after the presentation, or by all means, feel free to give me a call afterwards, and we can talk about the detailed regulations if you have specific questions. But it's probably more than we want to get into right now with a relatively short period of time. So the other thing you do want to be aware of is the salvage requirement. So any animal that you can hunt in Alaska, whether it's a salmon or a moose or a caribou or a duck or a grouse or ptarmigan, there are salvage requirements, which means you as a hunter are obligated to salvage certain portions of meat and parts of the body. The salvage requirements are really straightforward for small game. For hare, there is no salvage requirement currently, although there is a proposal going before the Board of Game this year that will create a salvage requirement for for all hare. Currently, the only salvage requirement is for Alaska hare in Unit 9, which is down basically the entire Alaska Peninsula. And that salvage requirement requires hunters to salvage either the hide or the meat. They can choose whichever they want to salvage. With grouse and ptarmigan, the only salvage requirement are the two halves of the breast. So when you look at a cleaned carcass, which sadly, if we had been taking this class pre-COVID and hopefully certainly after COVID, you can get your hands dirty and get in there and like we've done in the past. It's a lot of fun. It's a good way to end this class, but teach you how to actually field dress one of these animals, and then you can take that meat home with you. But so once you clean the bird, you can see that it's just like a rotisserie chicken or a turkey, if you're familiar with cooking those. The only salvage requirement for those is the two halves of the breast. So one question you might have is, okay, well, it said 15 per day, 30 in possession. Well, what is possession? And possession is defined in our regulations as whole birds or edible meat of game birds, excluding those that are canned, frozen, smoked, dried, or otherwise processed for human consumption after a 15-day period. So if you kind of take the legalese out of that, basically what it says is if you have cleaned your bird and either eaten it or frozen it, put it in the freezer, that has left your possession. So you no longer have a possession limit. So you can go back out and continue harvesting more birds. So in Alaska, we're pretty lucky. We have some youth hunt opportunities for families. I have a young son who's really getting into hunting lately, and we've taken advantage of these as well. The Hatcher Pass Youth Hunt Management Area is a great opportunity. It's for the first 15 days of the season, so August 10th to the 25th. The Hatcher Pass Youth Hunt Management Area is open only to young kids 16 and younger. And then the Ski Lac Loop Wildlife Management Area is also another opportunity on the Kenai Peninsula for young kids as well. So I always like to put a little plug in for our regulation process that I don't think many folks understand or maybe fully appreciate, that wildlife, fish and wildlife in this country is a public trust resource. And folks like myself are hired to manage your resource. And the Board of Game or Board of Fish is the body that is appointed by the governor of our state to address regulations and essentially ensure that these populations are managed sustainably. Well, in so doing, you as a member of this public trust process and resource have the ability to affect change, whether it involves fishing regulations or hunting regulations or whatever it might be. A lot of folks aren't aware that this is a very, very public process, particularly in Alaska, more so than other state systems. So I would encourage you to learn more about the Board of Game or Board of Fish process and actually openly engage that process, attend meetings, and write a proposal for a regulation change if you're frustrated or feel that there's a need to affect regulations. I just like to kind of put that plug in there for folks, particularly those that aren't aware of that process. Okay, so you've gone out, learned about the different species, you understand the regulations, you're interested, you want to get involved, and you've gone out and harvested some birds. This is a really high quality protein source that a lot of folks in Alaska can take advantage of. It's a very lean, very, very healthy, like I said, high quality protein. Small game really kind of runs the gamut on light to dark meat. Rough grouse is frankly one of my all-time favorite wild game meat types. If I had to choose one to eat for the rest of my life, wild game meat, it would probably be a rough grouse. And that's a very light meat, very similar to chicken. And then we have, it runs all the way up to ptarmigan, which is typically pretty dark meat. I encourage you to find a good recipe. There's so many different ways you can prepare these. It's a really great resource to getting a high quality food source. Okay, so legal methods for hunting. Small game is one of the few clusters or categories of species that there are a wide array of legal methods to go out and hunt with. So the most common, as you might assume, is using a gun, and those come in a couple different types that we'll discuss here in a minute. But bow and arrow is also legal. In fact, there's an area north of Fairbanks on the Dalton Highway going up towards Prudhoe that within 5 miles of the road is only bow and arrow. And so some folks have really gotten into going up there and hunting snowshoe hares or ptarmigan within that 5 mile corridor. Falconry is a technique that's also legal in Alaska. It's a very highly regulated program that requires a long apprenticeship period. And there's generally very few folks in Alaska that actually fly falcons. Snaring is a legal method for all small game species, and air rifles are legal as well. So firearms, I'm not going to go into any great detail because you could spend a whole presentation just talking about guns and how they work and all of that. In fact, if you are interested or haven't taken a hunter education course, I would encourage you to consider that, because they do go into really great detail about the different types of firearms and their value in certain situations. It's a really, really well administered and run program. But I will touch on it briefly. So guns are the most common and widely used method for hunting small game. A lot of folks use shotguns, but 22 rifles are also pretty popular. Shotguns, for those of you that aren't familiar, in the lower left picture here, it's sort of a schematic of a typical shotgun shell where you might have anywhere from 50 to over 100 individual BBs in one shotgun shell that go out and spread out as they move away from the end of the barrel. And they're very effective for animals that are either running or flying. It sort of creates this big pattern of BBs. Whereas a 22 rifle is it's a great gun for animals that are stationary, like a snowshoe hare, or even a ptarmigan that's sitting under a spruce tree in the winter or something like that. It's a great gun to teach new and young hunters because there's zero recoil, which is often one of the scariest parts for beginning shooters. So this is actually my dog, who sadly is recovering from ACL surgery right now, but he'll hopefully be out there later this winter with me. But I would encourage you to consider taking your dog small game hunting with you. I've started taking my dog with me, and it's just been absolutely tremendous. Not only are we finding more game when we're out there, but what's more important, in my opinion, is that we're actually recovering everything that we shoot at or harvest. Periodically, folks aren't able to recover every single animal that they harvest. They might fly away or fall into a hole somewhere, and you just can't get them. But with hunting with the dog, it's a game changer. It's been I've become a much more effective hunter, and plus it's just a lot of fun to have your companion out there with you too. So I'd encourage you to consider taking your dog out with you, particularly if they know basic commands: come, sit, stay. If you can keep them controlled to some degree, they're great to have with you. So living in Alaska, I'm sure for those of you that are in Alaska right now, I'm sure you all are aware that the weather can change very, very quickly. And whether you're up in the mountains in late August trying to chase ptarmigan, or you're out on the tundra in January looking for grouse or hares, the weather in Alaska can be a very, very formidable opponent to achieving your goals. So I just encourage you, our small game seasons in Alaska run very, very long. They start, early to mid-August, and in some cases run through March or even April. So it really run the full gamut of potential weather that you can experience in our state in a given year. So just be prepared for whatever situation you're going into. Good gear is a must in Alaska for any of you that have spent any appreciable amount of time outside in Alaska in different times of the year. You'll definitely appreciate that. All right, so kind of getting to the meat of it here. If you want to go out hunting, where do you go? What do you look for? So that's kind of what we're going to cover here at the end. So I'll start with fall hunting with ptarmigan. And you'll see on the bottom here, there's a figure that was actually based on about 150 radio-collared rock ptarmigan on a study we did in Unit 13 a few years ago. And you'll see that the red circles indicate late summer, early fall. And as that snow begins to build, those birds are forced to move to lower elevation to find food. And you see some of the lowest elevations are occurring in January, February, and early March. So in the fall, when you go out ptarmigan hunting, like I said, willow ptarmigan really are obligate willow consumers. They eat willow buds and stems pretty much all the time. And that is where you're going to find willow ptarmigan in the fall. And where you find willow, you often find water. So that's why willow is very commonly found in along small riparian creeks up in the alpine, or even in this case, sort of some larger subalpine rivers in the Alaska range. Rock ptarmigan, however, are found at slightly higher elevations. In fact, when we did our research on rock ptarmigan in the Alaska range, what we found is that when the chicks actually hatch, the hen marches those chicks up to some very high elevations, in the kind of the foothills of the Alaska range up to 4,500, in some cases even 6,000 feet, which is really where you start to get that ice rock interface with glaciers. And those birds will actually stay there until the snows force them down. And on a year with poor snow quality or snow depth, those birds will stay there as long as they possibly can. So when folks call me and say, gosh, Rick, I looked for rock ptarmigan up in the Alaska range. I spent 3 days hiking around and I didn't see one. And my first point is almost always to go higher. If you're not finding birds, go higher, which can be disappointing to hear, but because it's, oftentimes these places are hard to get to, but that's typically where the birds are. In the wintertime, as I said, these birds will be forced to lower elevation. And in some cases, you might find all three species commingled in the same flock. But what you're looking for really in the wintertime are these tracks, particularly a day or two after a fresh snowfall. They'll lay down lots and lots of tracks, and that can be a really good, useful tool to help you narrow your search to figure out where these birds are. In fact, a pair of good binoculars can go a long, long way in saving you many miles of walking or snowshoeing or skiing. You can sit on a hillside and just use your binoculars to scan and look for these tracks. And then oftentimes when you do, birds are generally close. So for grouse, it's interesting. We're kind of in the throes of the prime grouse season this year, or the prime time of grouse season. So a lot of folks in Alaska and elsewhere that have good grouse populations often will walk or even drive these remote kind of gravel roads and look for grouse, particularly early in the morning or late in the evening. They're collecting grit and gravel that will then go into their gizzard to help them digest their food. But they often do this in the fall, and they often do it very early in the morning or very late in the evening. And that's how a lot of folks will locate grouse, and then they'll flush them into the forest and go chase them that way. In the wintertime, here in South Central especially, we have rough grouse that were introduced about 20 or 30 years ago in the Matsu Valley. But we also have spruce grouse, which are very abundant. What we've noticed is that spruce grouse tend to move up into the spruce trees about late September, early October, and they tend to spend most of their winter in these spruce trees, feeding on spruce needles. So after about mid-October, it can actually be more challenging to find spruce grouse than it is during the month of September, say. And it's unusual, excuse me, we don't quite know why they do that so early, even when there's good food available on the forest floor without even any snow, but they are moving up into the spruce trees. Rough grouse, however, are more of a ground dweller year round, and they can be found throughout the hunting season, even into the winter on the ground. The one thing I will mention, discussing roads and accessing grouse off of a road is, not sure if folks are aware, but the number one hunting violation in the state of Alaska is shooting on, from, or across a roadway. And in many of those cases, it's at grouse. In fact, I talk to the troopers quite often, and they say that's one of the most common hunting violations that they write citations for. Hunting snowshoe hares, the snowshoe hare season is currently open year-round. However, the vast majority of snowshoe hare hunters pursue them during the snowy months of the year, so November to, say, March. And really what you're looking for when you go out snowshoe hare hunting is dense stands of willow, specifically willow, not alder, which can look very similar to willow, but you want to find willow. Snowshoe hares feed on willow exclusively in the wintertime. And the photo in the upper right-hand corner depicts some willow stand up around Eureka that was very heavily browsed by snowshoe hare last winter. So where you find good habitat, you want to further constrain your search by looking for what are called runs, which is where these paths basically through the willows that snowshoe hares use repeatedly, night after night after night. to move throughout the stand of willows. And where you find those really hard packed runs is typically where you're going to find good hare hunting opportunities. So for those of you that are still interested after all that 40 minutes of me talking away, are still interested in small game hunting and want to learn more, there are a tremendous number of opportunities that you can still pursue after this presentation, both with dog training, conservation, outdoor conservation groups, but also social media and different things on the web that you can find too. And of course, you can always reach out to me, and if you have any questions at any point in your pursuit of small game hunting, that's what we're here for, is try to answer your questions and help you focus that search. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and open it up for questions.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions. I'm going to start from the first. This is from Zach. He says, "Hi, Rick. How long after a fire takes place would you expect to find sharp tails? Down in South Central, we had the Swan Lake fire last summer. I spent some time there recently and only found spruce grouse in the unburned areas."
Yeah, that's a great question, Zach. So typically, sharp tails will move into a burn area anywhere from as little as a year to, they might move in a couple of years after a fire, but then they typically use it for maybe 5 or 10 years post fire, and that's when you start to see larger stands of aspen and birch growing, and where rough grouse might actually move in. To the sad part of my response, though, is that sharp tails are not typically found south of the Alaska range. As recently as a year or two ago in Hatcher Pass, but that was very unusual. Typically, sharp tails are more of an interior bird. We do see sharp tails every year along the Richardson Highway between Glen Allen and Paxson, but that's sort of the anomaly in their distribution. And my only thought is that other than the Swan Lake fire, which was massive, and the Kenai has had some massive fires over the last 5 or 10 years, typically where we see our biggest fires is up in the interior, and that's where sharp tails tend to proliferate pretty well.
Okay, so this is a two-part question from Kim. What is the age for a license? Her son is 8 years old. And the other part of that question is, hang on, she asked that twice. Oh yeah, and does he have to take the certification on his own or under her or his stepdad?
Yeah, so when you turn, I think it's 17 in Alaska, you have to have a hunting license. 17 or 18, I have to check on that. So your 8-year-old son will not need a hunting license. As far as taking the course, I think the hunter education program recommends kids be between the ages of 10 and 12 and older, but it all depends on the maturity of the child, really. I mean, my son, I think, was 11 when he and I took it. So I grew up in Wisconsin. I took my hunter's safety class when I was 10 or 11 in Wisconsin. Lived here for a number of years now, and when my son wanted to take it, I actually did the course with him and signed up and did it again. So they certainly, you can do that, no problem. Kind of go through that process with them. In fact, I'd almost encourage it, really, having gone through it with my son. It was a really good experience for both of us.
Okay, this is from Robert.
Real quick, Marion, I found that in the regulation. So it is 17 years or younger. You are not required to possess a hunting license when you turn 18.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Sierra.
Thanks, Sierra.
The regulation says constructed road or highway, but does not define what a constructed road is. And he also searched Title 5 and 16, but no definition. A constructed road to him is asphalt road, but some could say a gravel road is constructed road. Which is a constructed road?
So when I talk to the troopers, how they enforce the concept of a road is if it's maintained, if it's a maintained roadway. So, well, what's a maintained roadway? If it's a gravel road, if it is a kind of a constructed, maintained roadway, it doesn't matter if it's gravel, asphalt, single lane, double lane, interstate, doesn't matter. If there is a road grade that has been put down through over the landscape that elevates a road bed off of the landscape and is to some degree maintained, that is considered a road, and the troopers will enforce it as such. And to meet the letter of the law, you cannot shoot on, from, or across a roadway. So the flat surface of a road is obviously the road, but then the shoulder, that kind of the embankment that goes down into the ditch or into the forest, is also considered the roadway. So even if you're on the embankment shooting grouse, that's still technically illegal.
Okay. This is from William, and he would like you to share your contact information again.
Sure. Yeah, I'll share my screen and put that back up there. There you go. And actually the best way to reach me on a day-to-day basis, you can certainly call my office phone. I'm kind of split my time between the office and home work. And I'll just give folks my other phone number, 907-244-2443.
Okay. And so this is from Robert again, and he's asking about unorthodox harvest methods such as a blowgun or slingshot. Are they legal?
I'd have to check on the blowgun, but I do know slingshots are legal. Yep.
Okay. And this is from Kevin. He says, I noticed while caribou hunting this year up in the Clearwater Creek area of the Denali Highway that there was an incredibly low amount of ptarmigan and hare. Hunting for 3 days only turned up one bird. Do you have any insight as to the populations in that area, and if it was a particularly hard winter spring last year?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we've been getting that a lot. So we do both spring breeding surveys during the spring breeding season, and then we follow those up with summer brood surveys, where we go out and we actually try to estimate the number of chicks in each brood group that we interact with. And so when we were out there this spring in late April and May, we found average numbers of willow and rock ptarmigan pairs breeding on the landscape across the Denali and throughout the Alaska range. It kind of varied by location, but it was either near the long-term average or maybe slightly below the long-term average. So nothing too startling. What was interesting though, we went in June, we had 10 days of hard rain for 10 straight days where it literally almost never let up in, I think it was June 17th to 27th. And what we found with our research with radio collared birds, monitoring them very, very closely over the course of the breeding season and brood ring season, is that even so much as one day of really hard, cold rain, when chicks are, golf ball size or slightly bigger, they simply can't thermoregulate and they die of exposure. You add 10 days of consecutive hard rain and cold weather, and what we found when we went up and did our brood surveys in late July is that we found almost no chicks. And even more than that, when all the chicks die, the seasonal pair bond of rock and willow ptarmigan males and females breaks. And so those birds begin to form sexually segregated flocks, which we typically see in the wintertime. But if all their chicks die, that happens earlier. And so those birds tend to move out into different areas than we typically see them. And as a result, we anticipated very poor ptarmigan recruitment into the hunted population this fall, and it's proving to be accurate.
Okay, this is a question from Josh. He lives in Eagle River Valley, and he's wondering if small game hunting is legal in the Eagle River Nature Center area, or is that too close to the trails? He's wondering if you'd have to hike out past the bend or cross the river.
Yeah, good question. So again, that's in that Game Management Unit 14C, which I highlighted, has some more complicated regulations, and the Eagle River Valley itself is actually closed to small game hunting, the entire drainage. There are a couple very small exceptions to that, and those are areas that are only, there's one area that's south of Eagle River main stem up in the mountains, and I'd have to pull out the map to describe it. But again, feel free to call me and we can talk about that in more detail. But the Eagle River Valley proper itself, from Watershed Valley Wall to Watershed Valley Wall, is closed to small game hunting.
Okay, so this is from Kevin. He's asking if there are opportunities to volunteer in these surveys.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're always looking for volunteers. In fact, we're a very small program and we rely very heavily on volunteers, both for our spring breeding surveys, but also for our summer brood surveys. And the summer brood surveys, if you have or know of somebody with a well-trained pointing dog, we're always looking for folks to help out with those transects. And we have surveys really all across the state. So there's lots of opportunities to volunteer. And again, I'd encourage you just to reach out to me and we can talk more specifically about what your interests are. That'd be great.
Okay, this is from Kim again. She just wants you to reiterate the age for licenses for under 17.
Correct. So you have to be 18 years and older to you'll be legally responsible for having a license. Yeah.
Okay, that's all the questions I have. Does anybody else have any questions? There's one. This is from Zach. He's seen grouse in the western Prince William Sound on some of the islands. Do they have populations there, or do they travel from the mainland?
Yeah, no, they do have spruce grouse throughout Prince William Sound. In fact, I used to live in Cordova and hunt spruce grouse there quite a bit on some of those hills and forests. And I've seen them throughout the Sound. They tend to be pretty residential. The spruce grouse don't move a great deal, as best we can tell. So when they fly out to, say, Knight Island or Montague Island, they'll be self-sustaining out there for a long period of time.
Okay, Kelsey is saying thank you. So is George. So
yeah, thanks everybody for coming again. I appreciate it, and hope it was helpful and useful for you. Didn't waste your hour this evening.
okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rick. We really appreciate your time and expertise on the subject, and hopefully people get out this fall and explore the wilderness and maybe get some small game in their freezer for the winter.
Yeah.
So we hope that you all had learned something tonight, and if you would like to join us next Wednesday at the same time, 7 o'clock, for big game hunting, make sure to register. If you look at the Fish and Game's Facebook page, there was a post recently, and there will be another next week with that registration link. So just the same way that you registered for tonight. And in that chat, there's several links to different resources, the small game webpage, wildlife safety video, and more. So check those out and have a great night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.